Okay, thank you for inviting me. So you'll see this is a different title from the title in the program. This is joint work with Alon Clement. He's a long time co-author of mine. He's a law professor, and since I was asked to participate in this conference, we spoke about these issues. Our thinking has evolved over the last couple of months, and this is why we have this is why I have now a new title. I think it's simpler and better than the old title. Also, you should ignore the abstract. It's just uninformative. So the question I was asked to discuss was, I was asked to discuss inequalities that arise in access to justice and in legal proceedings, and what economic design approaches could be used to alleviate them. So the reason that access to justice is in green is because you'll see that my talk will focus on access to justice, and less so on inequalities. But of course, whenever there are restrictions on access to justice, different people are going to be able to access justice differently, and this is going to generate inequality. So if you treat this question purely from a mechanism design perspective, then in mechanism design, usually the designer imposes individual rationality constraints that specify the level of utility for each one of the participants. So inequality as such is not a concern because it can be completely controlled by the designer. But in practice, when people talk about access to justice, usually this refers to inequality in access to justice. This refers to inequality across different identifiable demographic groups, such as on gender, ethnicity, age basis, and so on. So, for example, I could have discussed a small claims court. So, a small claims court is a legal institution that recognizes, that is built on the recognition that access to the legal system is hard or unequal, and it facilitates access by allowing disputants to represent themselves. It employs simplified rules of procedure and evidence. It has lower fees, etc. But I have something much more interesting to talk about. What I want to talk about is the subject of consistency in legal decisions, and the main mechanism that determines this consistency is called Res Judicata. Okay? So one of the major themes in substantive law is that of consistency. And legal scholars recognize that in order for the law to be just and efficient, it has to be consistent. Now, suppose that you have two disputants or two litigants, and one of them has a claim against the other, and let's suppose the claim is this big thing. So if this big thing was decided by a court in one time, in one piece, there would be no issue of consistency. But the legal system is constructed in such a way that the plaintiff, let's say, can take this big thing and say, okay, first I'm going to litigate this particular aspect, and then I'm going to litigate this middle aspect, and then in the end, if I'm successful in both, or if I fail in both, or whatever, I'm going to litigate the third aspect. So this big thing could be litigated in 3 different cases, and once it can be litigated in 3 different cases, an issue arises of how does the court system, how does the legal system ensure that the decisions in the 3 cases is consistent. And the major procedural mechanism that addresses the issue of inconsistency is called Res Judicata. And what I'm going to do here in this short talk, I'm going to examine when Res Judicata is indeed necessary to maintain consistent application of the law. Now, I've been thinking about these issues for the last couple of months, and half a year ago, I never heard about Res Judicata. Okay, I didn't know what that was. And Res Judicata is a specific example of more general rules that are called estoppel rules. So if you check in the dictionary, so Res Judicata literally is Latin, and literally it means the thing or the matter adjudged, which doesn't tell you much about what it does. And estoppel, I think, is more, if you check in the dictionary, also it derives from Latin. And what it means, it's a bar or impediment or obstruction which precludes a person from asserting a fact, or from the other direction, it gives you a right to prevent a person from denying a fact. The way to think about this is the following. So Res judicata, what it does is that it specifies the effect that any adjudication has on all subsequent litigation. This quote is taken from a textbook by two authors, Cassad and Claremont. All the quotations in these slides are taken from this textbook. This is the authoritative legal textbook on res judicata. So suppose there are two cases, and they are litigated sequentially. There's the first case and the second case. So res judicata is applied in the second case. So the idea is that certain decisions that were made in the first case preclude litigants from asserting certain facts in the second case. So res judicata is applied in the second case, and because it's applied in the second case, it affects the considerations that litigants make in the first case. Okay, so it has this dynamic effect. Res judicata can be divided into two. There's something that's called claim preclusion. So claim preclusion says the following: a party generally may not relitigate a claim decided therein by a valid and final judgment. This means that once something has decided, you cannot litigate it again. It's in much the same way you submit a paper to a journal. Once the paper is rejected, you cannot submit the same paper again to the same journal. Okay? But here's the surprising or the strange part. So the judgment extinguishes the whole claim, fine, precluding all matters within the claim that were or could have been litigated in the initial action. This emphasis on could have been, and this is the emphasis, this is an important emphasis. So let's suppose that you suffer a certain damage, you sue. During the suit, you realize that the damage is much bigger than you thought. You don't put it in the original claim. When the case is over, now you litigate again for the additional damage that you suffered. The defendant can apply for res judicata and block you. Okay, so it has this arbitrary. There's a sense in which res judicata puts this arbitrary bound on what you can do. It blocks your access to justice. Issue preclusion states that a party generally may not relitigate any issue of fact or law, actually litigated and determined therein if the determination was essential to a valid and final judgment. So whereas claim preclusion implies that a plaintiff cannot assert a fact again, issue preclusion can be taken away and applies also to third parties in issues that are completely not related to the original suit. How is this related to market design or magazine design? We think about it in the following way. So think about substantive law as determining a mapping from the space of legal cases into the space of legal decisions. So substantive law says if the legal case is this, we want a certain legal decision to go with that. Procedural law, you can think of this as the mechanism or the rule or the game form that determines what is the game that the litigants are going to play, or what is the law going to do in order to achieve the legal decision. Okay. So res judicata legislation or rules introduce they have both ex ante and ex post effects. Ex ante, knowing that certain things are going to be precluded, induces the plaintiff to expand its claim as much as possible ex ante so as not to be blocked later on. Okay? And ex post preclusion is used by the court to reduce its workload and prevent inconsistency by importing prior decisions. Now, my co-author, except for being a law professor, is also appears in court in Israel, so he has also experience as a lawyer. And he says that, and also the textbook says that many litigants don't understand res judicata. Sometimes courts make mistakes, also make mistakes in the application of res judicata. And because of that, let's suppose that you made an honest mistake, and because of that, you didn't include in your initial suit something that is important, and you want to litigate it later. The defendant would appeal for res judicata and block you. But if the court thinks that you made an honest mistake, the court might allow you to benefit from the doubt and would not apply res judicata. On the other hand, if the court thinks that you've been strategic, obviously they will apply res judicata. This also increases this dilutes the effect of res judicata, and it complicates things further. So here, This is in this textbook by Cassad and Claremont. They mention all the different considerations that weigh in favor or against res judicata. And so they say that the things that favor preclusion, they divide it into factors that are efficiency-based and factors that are fairness-based. There are many different considerations. Because I'm pressed for time, I will not go over these. You know what? So there's the efficiency of avoiding wasteful litigation, efficiency of avoiding possibly inconsistent adjudication, many different things. And there are factors that favor non-preclusion. The authors of the textbook think that here the issues that have to do with fairness are more important than those that have to do with efficiency are less important. And they say, well, it's very easy. Well, they don't say it's very, but they say what you should do in order to decide whether res judicata should be applied or not. Just weigh all the benefits against all the costs and apply it if the benefits exceed the cost. Even they say in their textbook, they say, admittedly, although pretty simple and comprehensible, this formulaic schema looks a little silly. And of course, I mean, I don't think anyone can seriously try to evaluate all these different considerations. And so res judicata, in addition, on top of the basic idea, there are many exceptions and exceptions to the exceptions. A very complicated piece of, it's a very complicated rule. And because it's so complicated, people who have access to better legal representation are going to be favored by the system. People who don't are going to be worse off. So the research question that we ask here is, so the simplest application of res judicata is to bar repetitive litigation of the same issue, right? We don't want to allow the very same thing to be litigated again. And intuitively, so the question is what to do when you have two different issues. So intuitively, if these different issues are related, they should be barred. The second issue should be barred. And the question is, how do we determine relatedness? Okay? So the question is, what issue should be precluded by a former decision on an issue? And claim preclusion implies that the decision on one issue bars decision on another related issue. And issue preclusion says that the decision on one issue bars decision on the same issue in totally different claims or contexts. So what we have here, I'm going to present a very simple model, the simplest model we could think of, that illustrates what are the main issues here. So let's suppose there are just two cases and only two decisions that could be made in each case. Let's call them Y and N, right? Yes and no. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare a case where res judicata is applied and to a case where the two different cases are decided independently. And let's suppose that whenever a court sees a case, the court, and there are only two options, the court will make the correct decision with a probability P, okay? So there are two notions of relatedness. The first one is is that of stochastic correlation, okay? So what this matrix does, it describes the prior distribution of what is the correct decision in the two cases. So P1 gives the prior distribution that both cases should be decided yes. P2 gives you the prior distribution of that the first case should be yes, the second decision should be no, and so on. And the cases are stochastically correlated if this matrix, if the rows in this matrix are linearly independent. A second notion of relatedness has to do with separability. So the question is, W is the welfare function for making the two decisions in the two cases when the state of the world is theta. And the question is it the case that the decision from the two decisions can be decomposed into the social value of the decision from the first case and the social value of the decision from the second case? I think it's helpful if instead of writing social function as social welfare as a function of decision and the state of the world, think of social welfare as a function of whether the first decision is correct, the second decision is correct, and the third variable has to do, the third variable describes whether the decision was coherent or consistent or not. So suppose in this particular case, let's suppose that P2 is equal to 0. This means that if the court decided yes on the first question, it has to decide yes on the second question, if res judicata is applied. So we say that the decision is coherent if the decision falls, if y in the first decision forces y in the second decision. Okay? And if not, we say that the law is not coherent. And I think that legal scholars argue that coherence or consistency is a value in itself. Okay? So let's consider a simple case. So there's perfect correlation. There's perfect correlation in the decisions. So if the decision in the first case is yes, so should be the decision in the second case. And if it's no, then it should be no. Okay? And let's suppose that social welfare is separable. And I don't have time to do the calculation, but in this particular case, it doesn't, res judicata makes no difference. Social welfare would be identical. The second case is, again, you have perfect correlation, but now the decisions or the social welfare is not separable. And here, it's a simple calculation. You can show that res judicata would give you higher social welfare. And the third example shows that if you have stochastic independence, then even if you have, then in that case, in some sense, the decisions are independent. So in that case, even if social welfare is not separable, res judicata would not make a difference. So what are the conclusions that we derive from this simple example? So the first conclusion is that both notions of relatedness are necessary to justify res judicata. So contrary to what we thought when we started thinking about this, so stochastic correlation in its own is insufficient. You need also non-separability. And the second conclusion is that in the case of perfect correlation, res judicata dominates independent adjudication if social welfare is non-separable, and we need something extra, which is increasing differences. So, all right, so I do have a formula. So consider this example where you have perfect correlation in what is the correct decision. And let's suppose that deciding both cases correctly gives you 1. Deciding the first case correctly and the second one incorrectly gives you A. The first one incorrectly and the second one correctly gives you B, and both incorrectly gives you 0. In that case, you can show that res judicata dominates deciding independently if and only if A plus B is smaller than 1, if and only if you have increasing differences. Okay? So intuitively, what is going on here is that if you apply res judicata, it means that you're always going to respect consistency. This means that either you make the correct decision, or when you make an incorrect decision, you make a big mistake because you're going to be wrong on both cases. On the other hand, if you allow cases to be adjudicated independently, it allows you to, so if you get one case wrong, you can still get the second case right. So intuitively, there's a trade-off between what do we want? Do we want consistency with possibly big mistakes, or do we want small mistakes at the price of a possible inconsistency? This is why this property of increasing differences is important. So when would increasing differences be plausible? So increasing differences captures the idea that full justice is super additive, as would be the case, for example, if violation of consistency by itself is bad. And I think legal scholars seem to think that it is bad to violate consistency, even if you get the whole thing wrong. On the other hand, not having increasing differences captures the intuition that justice has a decreasing marginal value. Okay. The last thing I want to say, so this is a very simple model. In order to consider more, in order to extend it, the most obvious thing we need to think about is that we have taken the case where the ordering of the two decisions is exogenous. But of course, in practice, the plaintiff is going to decide whether to litigate two issues separately or whether to do them together. And if separately, the plaintiff can determine whether to do the first one first and the second one second, or flip the order. This has to be taken into account. And in order to do this, for this formulation we had here, we only looked at social welfare, but of course, We need to also know what is the benefit that the parties derive from the litigation, and we have to think about how this integrates with how this determines social welfare. All this has to be taken into account together. So, thank you.